The sun was a burning disk above the horizon, casting long shadows over the dry earth of Savo, Kenya. The dust swirled with every step as Elijah followed behind his grandfather, quiet as the wind. The old man moved with the slow certainty of someone who had walked the land all his life, his worn boots pressing into the cracked soil, each step deliberate. Elijah mirrored his movements, trying not to think about the weight of the silence that had followed him since the accident. Just 3 weeks ago, his parents had died in a car crash on the Nairobi highway. There had been rain that day, rare. Heavy, sudden, the kind that turned roads to rivers and cars to coffins. Elijah remembered the phone call, the numbing silence that followed, and the way the world felt colder even under the African sun. Now he was here, walking the bush with a man who barely spoke except to point at tracks or listen to birdsong. His grandfather had taken him in without question, but they weren't close, not yet. And Elijah, just 10 years old, already carried a grief too big for his small shoulders. It was that grief that made him stop. Faint sound so soft, he thought. He imagined it reached his ears. A whimper, a struggling breath. He paused, turning his head toward a dense clump of bush near a dried-up riverbed. "Elijah," his grandfather called ahead, not looking back. "Keep up," but Elijah didn't move. The sound came again, this time clearer. A weak, broken growl, more breath than voice. He took a cautious step forward. "Elijah," his grandfather snapped, turning around. "It's dangerous to wander off out here." "There's something," Elijah said. "In the bush, I heard it." The old man sighed, clearly frustrated, but the tone in Elijah's voice, earnest, uncertain, but firm, made him pause. With a groan, he turned and followed the boy toward the sound. They pushed through thorn and grass. And then they saw it. Nestled against the body of a full-grown lioness was a cub no older than a month. Its fur was matted, ribs showing through. Its skin like sharp fingers, eyes sunken but still defiant. The lioness was clearly dead. Her side was riddled with bullet wounds, flies already gathering. Elijah's breath caught. "Poachers?" His grandfather nodded grimly. "Most likely. Killed her for her teeth or claws. Maybe her meat. And the cub? Left to die." Elijah crouched down slowly. The cub growled again, a tiny rasping sound that was more courage than threat. Elijah extended his hand, heart pounding. "He'll bite you," his grandfather warned. "He's terrified," but Elijah didn't move. Something in the cub's eyes, those golden, haunted eyes, held him still. They reminded him of the way he'd looked at himself in the mirror the night of the funeral, angry, abandoned, lost. "I know what it's like," Elijah whispered. "I know." The cub didn't bite. Instead, it collapsed forward, exhausted, its head falling against Elijah's hand. They wrapped the cub in a blanket and took him back to the camp. Elijah stayed by his side that night, refusing food, refusing sleep. The cub didn't move much, except for the occasional tremble in his paws or twitch in his ears. Elijah spoke softly to him the entire time. He named him Baruti, a name his grandfather had once mentioned around the fire. It meant teacher in Swahili, because you're going to teach me how to be strong again. Elijah murmured, "Ba, are you I survived the night. In the weeks that followed, Elijah became the cub's shadow." He woke early to mix warm milk with a syringe, fed him gently, cleaned his wounds, and coaxed him to take small steps. The cub was weak, but he had a stubbornness in him, a refusal to give up that mirrored Elijah's own struggle to make sense of his new world. His grandfather began to help. Quietly, at first offering bits of advice on how to feed wild animals, how to care for wounds without losing the animal's natural instincts. "You're not raising a pet," he said one night, watching Elijah carefully brush dirt from Baruti's fur. "You're raising a lion. Don't let him forget that." Elijah nodded. He didn't want to tame Baruti. He just didn't want to let him die. Baruti grew stronger. In 2 months he could walk beside Elijah without stumbling. In 3 he could run, and in 4 he let out his first real roar, small and cracked, but it shook something loose inside Elijah's chest. A sound of life, of survival, of something finding its place in the world again. The cub who had once growled with fear now followed Elijah everywhere. At night they would sit beneath the stars, Elijah speaking softly, reading from old books. or making up stories about what Baruti would do when he grew up. "You'll be king of this place," he'd say. "Not because you rule, but because you remember." One night, Elijah looked at the lion, now nearly as tall as him when he stood on his hind legs, and whispered, "You saved me too, you know." Baruti blinked slowly, his massive head resting. Beside Elijah's, the boy laid his hand on the lion's mane and closed his eyes. Two orphans. One heart bound by grief. Rebuilt by love, years passed, but the memory of that first night with Baruti remained sharp in Elijah's mind. What began as a desperate attempt to save a dying cub turned into something neither of them could have predicted, a bond deeper than friendship, older than blood, more ancient than words. Elijah grew taller, his face lean and sun-darkened, his hands became calloused, his shoulders broader. Baruti grew too faster, stronger. His legs lengthened, his frame filled out, and his mane thickened into a golden halo that shimmered like fire in the sun. But his eyes, those deep amber eyes, never changed. They still held the same question the cub had asked that day in the bush. "Can I trust you?" Elijah had answered with action, not words. His grandfather expanded the sanctuary, fencing off wider portions of wild land where injured or rescued animals could live without cages. It was a delicate balance, keeping them protected while letting them remain wild. Lions, elephants, cheetahs, even wounded birds of prey found shelter there. It became a place of healing. But none of the creatures stayed as close to Elijah as Baruti. Every morning, Elijah and Baruti would walk the edges of the reserve together. The lion walked silently at his side, head high, shoulders rolling with quiet power. It startled visitors and frightened some of the new rangers, but Elijah would just smile. "He won't hurt you," he said. "He doesn't need to prove he's dangerous." Villagers from the nearby communities began to call them Wanawamutuni, sons of the wild. At first, it was whispered with suspicion. A boy who walked with a lion? Surely it was madness. But over time, the fear faded into reverence. Children would point and wave. Elders would nod in silent acknowledgement. They remembered the old stories, the ones that spoke of men who could speak with animals, who could understand the land's true language. Baruti had become more than a lion. He had become a symbol. And Elijah? Elijah had found purpose. He studied biology and conservation through correspondence courses sent from Nairobi. By candlelight, he read about ecosystems, animal behavior, and how climate change was pushing the wild world into collapse. He took notes, asked questions, and shared what he learned with the local youth. Every Saturday, children would gather beneath the acacia tree near the sanctuary's gate, where Elijah would teach them not from textbooks but from the bush itself. Baruti often sat just a few feet away, lying in the grass, blinking lazily under the sun. The children were fascinated by him, but always respectful. Elijah taught them how to read his posture, how to sense his moods not as entertainment, but as understanding. "He is not your pet," Elijah would say. "He is not your toy, he is your neighbor, he is your mirror." Baruti, for his part, never showed aggression to the children, not once. Only once did he rise and growl deep and low when a group of new rangers arrived carrying loud rifles across their chests. Elijah had to calm him down, speaking softly in Swahili until the lion's muscles relaxed. "He doesn't like metal," Elijah explained, "especially when it smells of death." Despite the peace, there were moments of tension. Some of the villagers worried Baruti would forget himself, that one day he might snap and attack. Others feared that letting a lion grow so close to humans was unnatural, even dangerous. Elijah understood their fear. He didn't argue. He simply let the years prove them wrong. But nature, as he learned, is never static. It changes quietly, constantly, and sometimes it changes for the worse. The rains grew unpredictable. Rivers that once flowed in early spring arrived late or not at all. The grasses withered. The antelope and zebra grew thinner. Farmers moved their herds closer to the reserve's edge, desperate to find food for their cattle. Tensions began to rise. One day, Elijah found a dead zebra inside the sanctuary. Not killed by lions, but by humans. Its body had been stripped of its meat, its hide roughly torn. Near the scene, he found a spent cartridge and tire tracks in the dry earth. Poachers, his grandfather said grimly. Or desperate herdsmen, hard to tell anymore. Baruti had smelled the blood too. He circled the site with his head low, tail twitching. Elijah placed a hand on his mane. "This isn't your fight," he whispered, but he knew better. Baruti had lived through this once already, the blood of his mother soaked into the soil. He hadn't forgotten. A few nights later, Baruti left the sanctuary. It wasn't unusual. He often roamed the outer plains, but this time he didn't return by dawn. Elijah waited, one day. Then two, on the third morning, just as the sky turned pink, Baruti returned. His mane was dusty, and there was a fresh scar across his shoulder. Elijah approached cautiously, seeing something fierce and unsettled in the lion's eyes. "What did you see out there?" he asked, brushing the dust from Baruti's fur. The lion didn't answer, of course. But he didn't need to. Something had changed. Elijah looked out across the open land, where smoke sometimes rose in the distant signs of burning bush. Cooking fires and trouble. Baruti had grown into a king, but even kings, Elijah realized, couldn't hold back the coming storm. The dry season came early that year, without warning. By mid-May, the river that split the reserve had turned to a string of cracked puddles. Dust hung in the air like smoke, coating everything: trees, skin, lungs in a fine, chalky film. The heat was constant, and even the wind, when it came, brought no relief. Only the animals moved without complaint, their instincts honed by centuries of drought and survival. Elijah moved through it like a man inside a dream, chasing water and patching fences, calculating how much longer they could hold out before the boreholes failed. Each morning he rose to the sound of silence. No birdsong, no insects, only the occasional cough of a distant lion. At his side always walked Baruti, but something was changing in him. Baruti was still loyal, still followed Elijah's voice, still brushed his great head against the boy's shoulder when they sat beneath the acacia tree. But his eyes were different now, harder, always scanning the horizon. Sometimes Elijah would catch him staring across the plains, mane rippling in the breeze, muscles taut as if he was listening to something Elijah couldn't hear. "He's remembering," Elijah's grandfather said one evening as they watched. Baruti stalked along the edge of the sanctuary, nose lifted to the wind. "What it means to be wild. You raised a lion, Elijah." "Not a dog." "I know," Elijah said softly. "But I'm not sure the world outside remembers what it means to let something stay wild." The grandfather didn't respond. He didn't need to. That week they found the first carcass. It was an elephant, young, female, no more than 10 years old. Her tusks had been hacked off, her body left to rot in the sun. The flies were so thick Elijah could barely breathe. Single set of tire tracks led away into the trees. "They came through the south gate," Elijah muttered, kneeling beside the body. "How did we miss this?" His grandfather said nothing. His face was carved in stone. "Ba, are you Tay?" growled. The sound was low and long, deeper than Elijah had ever heard. Not a warning. Not fear? Rage. It was the kind of sound that made the wind stop. From that day forward, Baruti no longer slept in the center of the reserve. He began disappearing more often, tracking through the outer brush, alone. Elijah tried to follow once, but the lion slipped away too easily, like smoke through fingers. Days passed. Then another kill, this time a giraffe. No tusks, no horns. Just meat, taken cleanly, quietly. "This isn't poaching anymore," Elijah said. "It's desperation." The villages bordering the sanctuary were struggling too. Their cattle were starving. Crops were dying in the sun. Water was too far, too dirty, or just gone. People had begun grazing livestock dangerously close to the sanctuary lines. Some blamed the animals for taking up space. Others blamed Elijah for protecting the animals while people starved. He understood their anger. But he also understood something they didn't. The moment you turn on the land, it turns on you. One night, Elijah heard movement outside the research tent. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. Baruti stood at the edge of camp, his eyes glowing in the beam of light. But he wasn't alone. At his feet lay the body of a young, wild beast freshly killed. Elijah froze. Baruti hadn't hunted within the sanctuary for years. Food had always been provided out of safety. The sanctuary didn't discourage predation, but it was managed, controlled. This WASN single quote slowly. Baruti didn't flinch. He stood over the kill like a statue, eyes locked on Elijah's, as if daring him to say something. "You're hunting again," Elijah said, voice trembling. "Why?" The lion blinked slowly. Then, without a sound, he picked up the carcass and dragged it into the bush. That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. Was this what his grandfather warned him about? That you can raise a lion, but you can't keep him from being one? Or was this something else? A message? The next morning, Elijah found new footprints in the dry earth near the western gate, human footprints, fresh, at least 3 men, and near. Then another snare, a crude trap. Barbed wire, meat. His heart stopped. He dismantled the snare carefully, anger building like a storm inside his chest. He didn't tell his grandfather. He didn't need to. The old man already knew. The lines between man and beast were blurring. Baruti wasn't the only one hunting. Elijah knew what would come next. Someone would panic. A lion would be blamed. And someone, either man or animal, would pay for it. He spent the next 3 nights walking the perimeter with a flashlight and his rifle. Not to shoot, but to scare, to show presence. To remind whoever was sneaking in that the land was not yet unguarded. But on the 4th night, Baruti didn't come back. Dawn came with no paw prints. No roar. Only silence. Elijah searched for hours, calling softly into the grass, through trees and ravines, heart pounding with every step. At last, near the dried riverbed, he found it, a trail of blood, faint but steady, leading away from the sanctuary. Into the bush. At the center of the trail lay one of Baruti's thick mane hairs. Caught in a thorn, Elijah knelt, hands shaking. "Please," he whispered to the ground. "Please don't let it be too late." Then he stood and he followed the trail into the trees. The night it happened, the air was too quiet. Not the calm of peace, but the heavy silence of something holding its breath. Even the insects had stilled, their usual chorus of chirps and rustles absent. The wind, which usually whispered through the tall grasses of Savo, refused to move. Elijah stood at the edge of the eastern enclosure, flashlight in hand, examining a section of broken fencing. A bull elephant had rubbed against it that morning, loosening the poles. Normally, Elijah would have repaired it during daylight, but something had pulled at him all evening, a restlessness he couldn't shake. He crouched to fit a new post, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the dry earth. When a crack rang out in the distance, a single gunshot, his body tensed. The sound echoed through the stillness like a slap. His heart dropped into his stomach. Then he ran. He didn't think, he didn't speak. He just ran, the beam from his flashlight bobbing wildly across the path. He knew where he was going. Every part of him, every memory, every instinct screamed. One name, call on. B.A. R.U.T.I. The acacia tree emerged from the dark like a sentinel. It stood tall and ancient, its branches outstretched like open arms. They had spent countless evenings here, Elijah and Baruti, sharing silences, sharing stares. Elijah with his notebook, Baruti with his slow, watchful eyes, and now, beneath that tree, Baruti lay, the great lion's tawny flank heaved in uneven breaths. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and thick against the red earth. His golden eyes, usually burning with untamed fire, were dim, soft, almost apologetic. A snare coiled tightly around his hind leg, the wire biting into his flesh. But it wasn't the snare that would kill him. It was the bullet. Elijah dropped to his knees beside him. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." He pressed his hands against Baruti's side, trying to stop the bleeding. It was useless. The wound was too deep, too close to the lungs. Baruti's breath came in ragged pulls, each one a battle. "Stay with me," Elijah sobbed. "Don't you dare leave me." Baruti's great head lifted, just slightly. His gaze found Elijah's, steady, knowing. He didn't growl. He didn't roar. Instead, he reached out with his paw and placed it gently on Elijah's chest. A gesture. A goodbye. A final act of trust. Elijah felt the weight, not just of the paw, but of everything Baruti was. The king of this land? A creature born into pain, rescued from a circus cage, brought back from the brink of madness by time, space, and one man's stubborn love, a lion who had been given every reason to hate humans but had chosen, instead, to love one. And then he was still. No final roar. No grand moment. Just stillness. For a moment the earth seemed to forget how to spin. Elijah pressed his forehead to Baruti's mane, inhaling the familiar scent dust and sun and wildness. He let out a sound that tore from the depths of his soul. A scream not of fear, but grief. Pure, unfiltered, heart-shattering grief. The kind of sound that only comes when something sacred has been taken. He didn't know how long he stayed there. An hour. All night. Time lost meaning. Eventually the wind began to stir again, as if the land too was slowly coming back to life. A soft breeze rustled the acacia leaves, and far off an owl hooted once. Elijah stood, knees shaking, and looked down at his friend, his brother, his teacher. Baruti's eyes were closed now. His body still noble, still regal, even in death. Elijah knew what he had to do. He would bury him here, beneath the tree they had claimed as their own. Not behind fences, not in a cold veterinary lab. Here, where the sun rose golden and the birds sang each morning. Where Baruti had found peace. He returned with a shovel and tools, his movements slow and deliberate. The earth was hard, but he dug deep. Every stroke of the spade a prayer, a memory. He wrapped Baruti's body in a woven cloth, one of the Messiah blankets Elijah's grandmother had gifted him long ago as dawn broke across the savannah, streaking the sky with orange and rose. Elijah lowered the lion into the ground. Birds began to sing again, cautiously at first. Then louder, as if paying their own tribute. He carved a stone himself, rough and uneven, but honest. The words etched into it read, "Baruti, king, friend, spirit of the wild." Elijah knelt by the grave and placed his hand on the stone. The grief sat heavy in his chest, but beneath it something else stirred resolve. Baruti's death would not be the end of the story. Poachers had stolen his life, but they would not steal his legacy. As the sun climbed higher, warming the earth, Elijah made his way back to the sanctuary. The animals stirred in their enclosures, unaware of the loss. The wind carried with it the scent of dust and life and something ancient. Elijah stopped and turned back toward the tree, and for a heartbeat, a brief, impossible heartbeat, he thought he heard it, a roar, not of rage, not of fear, a final roar, long and low, filled with sorrow and strength. A sound not from the throat of a living beast, but from the bones of the earth itself. The voice of the wild saying goodbye to its son. Elijah closed his eyes. "I heard you," he whispered. And he walked on. The sun rose slower that morning, or so it seemed to Elijah. Light crept over the horizon like a hesitant visitor. Reluctant to shine on a world missing its king, he stood at the edge of the sanctuary, where acacia trees cast long shadows over the earth. His clothes still smelled of dust and grief. Baruti's grave sat beneath their tree, now surrounded by small offerings, feathers, smooth stones, and, from one of the village children, a small wooden lion carved with care and tears. The birds had returned. Their song, soft, tentative, floated over the fields like whispered blessings. Life, it seemed, was determined to go on, even when hearts broke. Elijah couldn't sleep that night or the next. Grief clung to him like a second skin. He walked the perimeter each morning, not for danger, but because the silence in his room was louder than the bush at dawn. He passed the grave often. He never looked away. He thought grief would destroy him. In some ways it had, but something else had begun to bloom in the hollow Baruti left behind. Not hope, not yet. Purpose. The world would not forget Baruti. Elijah would make sure of it. The sanctuary, once a humble collection of enclosures and volunteer quarters, changed. Elijah worked without rest, fueled by a quiet fury. He tore down the wire fencing around the memorial tree and planted wild grasses and flowering shrubs. He built a circle of benches from fallen logs, so others could sit where he had once sat with Baruti. He commissioned local artists to paint murals, one of Baruti standing proud against the rising sun, another of him resting peacefully, his mane blending into the roots of the earth. And above it all, carved in large letters across the main gate, Baruti Sanctuary, where wild hearts live on. But Elijah knew walls and signs weren't enough. Poachers still came, traps still littered the edges of the park. And worse, indifference still lingered in far-off cities, where decisions were made by people who would never look a lion in the eye. He needed to teach. To tell Baruti's story, not just to remember, but to change minds. So he built a school. It began with a single open-air pavilion near the sanctuary's edge, where children could sit on mats and learn about the land. Elijah taught them about lions and elephants, yes, but also about the web of life, the language of birds, the tracks in the mud that told stories older than textbooks. He taught them that nature was not something to be feared or conquered. It was something to be understood, revered, protected. The children came curious. Some came because their parents told them to, but many came back again and again. They listened to Elijah talk about a lion who had once been caged, then freed not just in body, but in spirit. A lion who had chosen to love a human, a lion who forgave. They learned that conservation wasn't just about protecting animals. It was about protecting what was wild within themselves, the part that still listened to the wind, that still looked up at the stars and wondered. One evening, long after the last lesson ended, a young girl lingered behind. She was no older than 10, quiet and thoughtful. She sat by Baruti's grave, tracing the letters on the stone with her fingers. "Do you think he knew?" she asked Elijah, not turning to look at him. "Knew what?" Elijah asked gently. "That you loved him." Elijah swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "Yes," he said, his voice low. "He knew." She nodded once, satisfied, and left him alone with the silence. That night, Elijah climbed the old watchtower that overlooked the plains. He watched as the moon rose, casting silver across the grasses. Somewhere in the dark, a hyena whooped, an elephant trumpeted softly. And then, faint but unmistakable, a sound that froze him where he stood, a roar, long, low, mournful, not a roar of defiance, but of memory. Not from a throat, but from the land itself. He closed his eyes. The people of Savo began to talk. They said the sanctuary had changed, that the air there felt different, charged with something older than sorrow. Children who had once thrown stones now whispered when they passed the gates. Some claimed they saw shadows move through the tall grass at night, shapes that looked like lions but vanished when approached, and on certain nights, when the moon was high and the wind moved just right, they swore they heard it, the last roar, a sound of longing, a sound of love. Elijah didn't chase the sound. He didn't need to. He carried it with him in the stories he told, in the lessons he taught, in the dreams of the children who now ran through the sanctuary paths, imagining themselves as protectors, not conquerors. Baruti was gone, but what remained was something greater. Legacy.